Bertucci and Rosenbaum have stated, quote, government is the institution which establishes the rules within which all other institutions must operate within a society, unquote, and public servants who implement the rules. Let's take a look at some of these public servants on the job, those working in times of crisis, some of the most demanding, dangerous and challenging of all public service jobs. Like the expression that all politics is local, most disasters are really local disasters. Natural and man-made disasters in the US are primarily the responsibility of local government. Operational control of the initial response to damage and destruction rests with a variety of local organisations, most of them agencies of city and county governments. Local government is often the first and only operational responder through organisations such as fire departments, emergency medical personnel, hospitals, police departments and county medical rescue squads. These first responders have situational dominance during the preliminary stages of an event. So as the face of governance, first responders and emergency services personnel carry a unique responsibility. They are the government, up close and personal, on the worst day of a citizen's life. Look closely and you will see the human dynamics of governance superimposed on their work. The human tragedy in the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti continues to unfold. As with Hurricane Katrina, disaster victims rely on government to take the lead in coordinating the response, to rally local, national and international donors and relief organisations. The images coming out of the capital of Port-au-Prince and the coastal city of Jacmel illustrate life and death, hope and despair in stark relief. First responders, public administrators, become the lifelines to a schoolgirl trapped beneath the rubble, to a pregnant woman rescued days later, to the dazed and bloodied father searching for his family. Calculations of success and failure are fluid, and accountability, discretion and responsiveness are bound together. Where should rescue efforts be focused? Which building to search first? Which victim to help? These same questions were asked in the aftermath of the 8.8 magnitude earthquake that struck Chile in February and will be asked again in the next disaster. Responsiveness also exacts a toll on those who respond. The line between victims and non-victims is not as obvious as might appear at first glance. Beyond those who have been hurt physically or have incurred losses of possessions are a wide variety of hidden victims. Rescuers themselves are impacted by disasters. Like personnel in emergency organisations, such individuals constitute a portion of the hidden victims of disaster. For example, journalists reporting from the front lines of the Haiti quake reveal that their struggle to reconcile the incompatible goals of filing their stories and simultaneously needing to help those whom they are reporting on. The emotional toll on those working at the edge of chaos can manifest itself in post-traumatic stress disorder and other physiological and psychological symptoms. Mitchell has found that more than 86% of disaster workers experience some symptoms of PTSD within 24 hours after their experiences at the scenes of major emergencies. Approximately 10% may be profoundly distressed by the event. They are unable to continue in that line of work. They experience a personality change. Their marriages and family life are disturbed, or they become physically ill. A large percentage of emergency workers experience powerful physical and psychological aftershocks to their work. The burden of being the face of government can be overwhelming. Responding in these environments can be career-changing, even career-ending. As part of my ongoing research with my colleagues, Professors Mary Guy and Sharon Mastracci, we have interviewed emergency services personnel in Florida, Colorado and Illinois in the US to learn how they do this work. This research extends our earlier work on the concept of emotional labour, and the focus on putting the service in public service. Listen to a chief in the Fire Rescue Domestic Preparedness Division speak about, quote, responding to New York in the aftermath of September 11. This is what he said. "We were deployed up there in New York, and that took me a good 2+ years to get past. The pictures don't do it justice. But when you physically get up there and you get out and you see 23 acres of destruction and fires underground, you know there's nothing you can do except volume recovery. Other guys had problems from that for years." First responders are exposed to dangerous life-threatening situations on a daily basis. A sense of fatalism and the fragility of life is a common refrain as first responders describe their experiences. For example, the tragic consequences of crimes place a great emotional burden on law enforcement officers to make sense of these outcomes. Being the face of government can bring about a heightened sense of the responder's own mortality. For example, hostage takings are one of the most difficult events for officers called to a scene because they can relate to it in terms of their own family. It brings them face to face with their own mortality. And officers' expectations of personal infallibility become tempered by incidences such as officer-involved shootings, the death of a co-worker, exposure to a grisly crime scene, or a police suicide. Crisis response can be defined broadly, of course. Challenges abound and government responds in each arena. The UN Millennium Development Goals provide a framework for looking at human processes writ large and include eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary health care, and so forth, including promoting gender equality and empowering women. You're familiar with each of these. Governments and their public servants have the obligation to aggressively address each of these global challenges. This is easier said than done, of course. To wit, the World Bank has estimated the UN goals for overcoming global poverty have been set back at least 7 years by the global fiscal crisis. It calculates that increased malnutrition last year may have caused an additional 44 million children to suffer permanent physical or mental impairment. I would like to mention one of these goals only, gender equality and women's rights. The case is Haiti, but it could be applied in any number of nations, including my own country. Gender equality in every aspect of Haiti's recovery and reconstruction process is vital to the country's future prosperity. Before the earthquake, Haitian women had a low level of political participation and held about 4% of seats in parliament. Lack of representation limits their voice in economic and social policy decision-making. Currently, Haiti has no specific legislation protecting women from sexual discrimination, nor does it criminalise gender-based violence. Given the traditionally limited role of women in decision-making processes at the household, village, and national levels in most cultures, their needs, interests, and constraints are often not reflected in policy-making processes and laws, which are important for poverty reduction, food security, and environmental sustainability. Access to decision-making and equal representation of men and women in positions of political and administrative power is key to addressing poverty, poor health care, sexual discrimination, and education deficiencies. Women must be able to participate in decision-making and political processes that affect us. The recent establishment of a single UN agency to promote equality for women, known as UN Women, marks a significant step in the advancement of women's rights. As Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, quote, "By bringing together 4 parts of the UN system dedicated to women's issues, member states have created a much stronger voice for women and for gender equality at the global level." Challenges surround us, but the context in which we are functioning is nothing less than a fiscal storm. The European Union economic crisis continues to unfold. Federal deficits are larger than they have ever been in peacetime, 11% of GDP is the latest projection for the current year in the US. State and local governments are going through their own fiscal ordeal, with fiscal gaps that are truly stunning. Consider, for example, that the state of Florida reduced its spending from $74 billion to $66 billion over the past 3 years. Along with the oil from the Gulf spill, the second wave of the housing foreclosure crisis is about to wash over us. These seemingly intractable challenges will continue to be debated, including here. And I want to take a few minutes to highlight just two of the less visible administrative challenges that become exacerbated in times of crisis. The first is measuring accountability. In public service parlance, accountability for is often followed by the words results. But what results? How do we know when they have been achieved? One dimension to measuring accountability is the problem of many hands. Many social and regulatory programs are implemented through an elaborate array of intergovernmental arrangements, and the delegation of authority for particular government programs is often dispersed across a number of agencies, all of whom are attempting to collaborate. This process is characteristic of much of the work of crisis and emergency response. The World Trade Center tragedy of September 11 is a case in point. A disaster response system of 456 public, private and non-profit organisations engaged in rescue operations during the first 3 weeks. Other sources identified more than 1,400 non-profit organisations involved in recovery activities over a 6-month period. The tension that exists between competing definitions of success poses another problem for measuring accountability. First responders can decide to make their work harder, more dangerous, and less officially successful in order to respond to the needs of the individual. They can overinvest their time and the state's resources, even though the chance of success is slim. A US Coast Guard officer tells of keeping a case open long after it could have been reasonably closed. And he says, the hardest thing to assess is someone's will to live. We had a Dominican fishing boat that sank at night off the coast of the Dominican Republic. 20 fishermen go in the water. We looked for a couple of days and found maybe half of them. We were well past what the table said they could survive. You know, a friend of mine said, Dominicans are tough people. They're going to keep swimming. So we kept looking. We went twice as long as the table said they could survive. Found one guy 4 days later, swimming the whole time. The second administrative challenge is managing expectations. Dealing with expectations is central to the work of public administration. Public servants behave in a manner that is driven by the need to effectively cope with expectations. First responders need to manage multiple, diverse, interactive, and oftentimes contradictory expectations that are inherent to their jobs. Met or unmet expectations can be explained in terms of the gap between what governments are prepared to do in an emergency management situation and what emerges as the expectations of those victimised by the disaster. The gap is the primary determinant of public perceptions about the success or failure of governmental relief efforts. Government is the provider of last resort. It responds to those in need. Denial of service is not an option, even when demand for service far exceeds the capacity to respond. This fact makes measuring accountability and managing expectations exceedingly more complicated than in the private sector. These challenges need to be met by a highly trained public service. There will be no argument for that in here. Public administrators who excel in both cognitive, technical competencies as well as emotive skills are likely to be more effective. Our graduates should become proficient in management, analytical skills and policy. These are essential cognitive skills, but these skills are necessary but insufficient for preparing our students to be effective public servants. Feedback from graduates often indicates that their training failed to adequately prepare them for the human processes involved in the administration and delivery of public services. Although provided with training in cognitive skills, they are left on their own to acquire an appreciation for and to develop skill in nuanced emotive skills. This is especially the case for graduates who work in service delivery programs that are emotionally intense, such as disaster services and emergency medical services. I will briefly mention 3 of these emotive skills. The first is expressing compassion. Focusing on the human processes of governance points up the centrality of person-to-person interactions in the citizen-state exchange. Being able to express care and concern for citizens in dire circumstances is an important skill for officials and public servants alike. For example, the case of Hurricane Katrina, federal officials there failed to communicate the proper tone for handling this crisis. Much of the public tone communicated by them was one of being in control rather than showing appropriate engagement that fosters trust and builds community. The message that government cares about what has happened to people because of the crisis, that efforts are underway to cope with the crisis, and here is what the public needs to do to minimise damage and help government efforts are key. An agency must establish control during a crisis, but also show compassion. For people whose lives have been disrupted or who are in shock, symbols of competent caring on the part of their government are extremely important. As we have seen with the events of September 11, governments suffer if they exhibit apathy. You may recall President George W. Bush's reaction to the news of the World Trade Center attacks, characterised by a paralysing lack of emotion. And the more recent criticism of President Obama's reported loyally and passive response to the BP Gulf of Mexico oil spill illustrate both how the media's portrayal can shape, if not predict, public perception and the importance of serving with feeling. The second emotive skill is suspending judgment and listening. For Camilla Stivers, responsiveness begins with listening. To quote her, public institutions take their shape partly as a result of how people at the intercept between agency and environment listen to and respond to one another, unquote. First responders are on the razor's edge of that intercept, at the edge of chaos. Listening is crucial as it helps them glean important information, define situations more carefully, and facilitates prudent action in turbulent environments. The third is adaptability and creative discretion. Instances in the Hurricane Katrina disaster of refusal on the part of government employees to bend or step outside the rules, or indeed to act at all, are legion. There was a failure to step outside the rules and to act to save lives and to help those in dire need. Many decided to renounce the exercise of discretion in favour of adhering to the letter of the law, to adhere strictly to bureaucratic rules and toe the line rather than help those in need. There was a widespread default to literalness. The outcomes may have been very different if administrative courage and discretion had been exercised. To conclude, the issues surrounding the human processes of governance and social inequality are both difficult to ignore and difficult to resolve. They are compounded in times of crisis. Crises and disasters are income neutral and colour-blind. Their impacts, however, are not. Gender differences in deaths from natural disasters are directly linked to women's economic and social rights. Gender inequalities become magnified in disaster situations. For example, in the 2004 Asian tsunami, as you know, an estimated 70 to 80% of overall deaths were women. We can probably agree with President Obama's words that what is important is not what is right or left, but what works. Public servants and public sector officials those of us in this room this morning and here at this conference this week, we do this work not because it is easy, but because it is hard. The most daunting challenges are assigned to government. Emergency personnel tackle the consequences of social inequality on a daily basis, whether they are responding to a natural or man-made disaster, a house fire, or a boat rescue of refugees. With my colleagues Mary Guy and Sharon Mastracci, we are continuing our research into public service at the razor's edge to shine a bright light onto how emergency services personnel do their work in some of the most horrific and unimaginable circumstances. So I would like to end where I began. We are here as public servants. Public service is a privilege. Let us find ways together to meet the challenges of our new century. We are in this together. Let's get to work. Thank you for your attention, for this opportunity to address this important gathering. Merci beaucoup and terima kasih.
Ladies and gentlemen, next is rumah from General Reporter of IIAS. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Andi.
As well, I'd like to thanks to the chairman of this event, Bapak Asnawi. Thanks a lot and staff. So make this very extraordinary happen. And also I would like to thanks to Mr. Loretta to select me as a general reporter, because this is military general, we have director general, but reporter general is the first. But it's, yeah, thanks a lot, this is very honorable assignment. And also, I think there are several things I want to address before we start with our conference discussion. We want to introduce our reporter, and the other one is for Subteam 2. I'd like to thank to Miss Dennis Amiet. Are you here? Yes. Yeah. Thanks a lot. From Canada. And Mr. Prabhas Kumarja. Yeah, thanks a lot. The new direction of our scientific exploration, of course, from our discussion today and also tomorrow. So for that one, that we already select some papers, so we are ideas, meaningful proposal, and also a conclusion. Report back at final plenary in Friday, and then after that, we will also try to make a conference proceeding for publication. At the end, we will recommend about 9 or 12 selected paper for publication in the International Review of Administrative Science. So this is what we are going to do. And if we look here, why we choose the theme is there are some reasons for selecting this theme. Especially we look here, constraint that we face now. We have economic, political, cultural, social, environmental, democratic, and technological constraint. As the keynote speaker already addressed, that many issues that we face now, including economic crisis, disaster, and etc. So that's why I think we should look again how we deal with the all constraints we have now. Could be different from the past, yeah, because we face something dynamic, something new. And we look here, public governance and management change and innovation. Should we change or we should innovate? Yeah, because between change, they say that change is following the previous one, but innovation is something new. So this is our choice, and this